lab review. What I'll do is I'll walk through a little bit of code. We'll then do a small exercise that mimics what we would have done in the lab or what we should have done in the lab. And then we'll talk about that, and then we'll go to the next thing. So we're gonna go into it some depth because I know it was challenging. I mean, this was building a full front-end application. Taking these sort of desperate skills that we've been kind of cobbling together with time. So we're gonna kind of make sense of it, demystify it a bit, and after that, we're gonna do this basically like a code along where we build a complete application using Firebase as our backend. Is essentially what Firebase is. And so we'll do that together, and there'll be some opportunities for you to work on that on your own. We may or may not finish all of Firebase today. I mean, it's a very sophisticated platform. There's no new JavaScript skills here. I mean, this is all just the JavaScript that we know and that we've used already. Really, all we're learning is a new library API, right? So Firebase is a JavaScript library. We have to learn how to work with its API. We're not learning anything new about JavaScript per se. We're just learning how to interact with this particular library. So, that's what we'll be doing. All right. So the homework review. I guess maybe I'll just start off. Are there any questions on the top of your head of things that you encountered in the homework? And I know maybe they'll come as we go, but I just wanted to know if there's any burning questions right at the top that we can talk about. Yes, that's a great question. It's a great question. Yeah. In the templates? In the hints?
This has class.
Oh, right, yes. Okay. So let's start looking at them a bit. And we'll talk about it, and then so this was probably in hint 2, right? Right here, right? Yeah, so this, here we have this, what are we doing here on this line 51? So are we clicking right here? Are we actually clicking? Is this a click? What are we doing here? Can you describe it in more precise language?
We're saying wait for the user to click on the span where the preferences are listed, and then when they do that, the function
Exactly, right? We're not doing a click. We're not even running the toggle interest function, right? What we're doing here is we're setting up an event listener, right? We're attaching an event listener so that when a span inside of this categories element, whatever it is clicked, has this click event, we're going to then run this function. So this function here, toggle interest, we would call that an event listener function, because its job is to listen for that event. Yeah?
I was slightly confused because I set up my first listener a little bit differently. It wasn't a delegated listener because it had this, I thought you could use the submit action just on it up. You know what I mean? Like in another app. So could you explain why using a delegated listener is better there? And the difference between click versus submit?
Yeah, sure. I will get to that. Let me finish answering this question, and then I'll answer that. But yes, that's next on my queue. All right, so here we have this event listener function toggle interest, right? So down here where we define this function, remember the thing we said is when we have a event listener function, this takes on a very specific meaning inside of that event listener function, right? And the meaning that it takes on is the element that was clicked in this case, or the element where the event occurred. So in this case, it's the element that was clicked. In other words, the span that was clicked. Okay? So this is the span that was clicked, and we're checking to see, does that span that was clicked have the class label primary? Okay? So if we look over here in our HTML, we have these spans. We'll have a list of these spans, and they may or may not have this class label primary, depending on whether or not they've been selected. So what we're doing there is when this is clicked on, we're going to use this to check, okay, is this individual span that's been clicked on, does it have that class? Okay, so does it have that class? And that's how we can tell, do we need to delete that interest or do we need to create that interest? Right? Because if it has that primary label, we know that the user selected it already. And we want to actually now delete it from their interest. Did I at least clarify that this? Okay. All right. So now, why did we use a delegated listener for the login here? And also, what's the difference between a click and a submit event? Right? Those are, am I correct in characterizing those questions? Okay, cool. So let's take a look at the HTML that we're concerned with here, right? So what we're looking for is some element that has a login submit ID that is a child of another element that has a login container ID. Okay? Can somebody remind me just the general use case for a delegated event listener? Why do we need to delegate event listener versus a normal directly bound event listener? Yeah. Right. So what's the reason we need delegated event listeners is because at some points when we load our page, there is HTML that's going to enter at a later time, right? So when we first load this page, the login submit, whatever this is, may or may not be on that page when the page first loads, okay? And if it's not there, when we try to attach an event to it, it won't work because there's no element there. And so we can't listen to the event on it. However, if we can find a parent of it that we know is there statically when the page loads, we can attach an event listener there and delegate for some child that may be added later. Okay, so if we look at the HTML, should clarify why we need to do it this way. So if we look at the HTML, right, disregarding all of the templates, okay, because the templates aren't there when the page first loads, right? The templates have to be rendered. So when the page first loads, all the HTML that's on the page is this, okay? So we can only attach event listeners directly to these things when the page first loads. Because until those templates are rendered, there is no login submit button on here. That button hasn't been rendered yet. And so if we try to attach an event listener to it right away, it won't work because that button isn't on the page. So we need to delegate the event listener, listen to this static element here that we know is there right from the beginning. And then we can listen for when its child with that appropriate ID has that event. Okay, does that clarify that part? Okay, now what's the difference between a submit event and a click event, and why would we use one over the other? So if you know the answer, go ahead. Right. Exactly right. So a submit event can only happen on a form. Okay, so on a form element. Okay, so an HTML form element, that's the only element that can have a submit event. Okay. Notice that though this functions like a form, it's actually a div. There's no form element here. Does that make sense? And since it's not a form, we can't actually listen to a submit event because a submit event will never occur.
It has to be an HTML form tag.
Exactly. It has to be an HTML form tag in order to have a submit event. A regular, a div with a button doesn't have a submit event. It will never occur. But the button does have a click event. So we can pretend this is a form by listening to this button's click event.
I think I just got confused with the button type. It's submit and I found that and that was a suspicious button.
Yeah. So if you're using, it is a bit misleading, you're right. If you're using this in a form, you would use a button type submit to say that this is a submit button versus a regular button. But outside of the form, that doesn't actually really mean anything. So yeah, that is a bit misleading. However, if there's no form, there's no submit event. Rule of thumb. Does that clarify those two questions? Cool. All right, so let's talk a little bit about, I'm going to go back to hint number 1. Let's talk a bit about what I did here. So the first thing you might have noticed when you started looking at this hint number 1 is at the top, I've kind of put a bunch of fake data into a model, right? So what I did is I created this model object up here at the top, and I just loaded it with fake data. Now, how did I know what this fake data should look like? Yeah.
I got mine from the HTML.
Okay, the HTML, that's one place where we could look. Where else could we look? Exactly. So if you notice, this looks exactly like what we found in the API docs. Okay. So if you look at, what's that? So let's take a look then. When we look at those API docs, you know, what we'll see is a lot of things here. Some of it we may need, some of it we may not need. But one thing we notice, right, is this feed has these articles that look like this. The feed is an array of objects. So in my model, I basically just copied this and put it into my model. And I called it articles in my model. So I took that portion of the API and I just put it somewhere inside of my model. Okay. And I did the same thing with categories. And I also stored my username, my user ID, and I put a little logged in property in here. And I did it all in one big model object. Okay. You don't have to do it this way. You could split it out in separate variables. I tend to prefer this way, all one big model. Okay. Does anybody know why I would create this model with a bunch of fake data in it? Why would I even bother doing that? What's that?
Testing.
Yeah, testing what?
Making sure that it pulls up on the screen.
Right. Basically, this is so I can test my templates, right? I can put a bunch of fake data in here so that I can open this up and test my templates and make sure my view layer is working properly. Make sure my render functions, and my template strings on my HTML, make sure those things are working like they're supposed to. Okay. So I don't want to bother getting real data yet. That's further down the line in my development process. So instead, I'm just going to create this mock model with fake data in it, so that I can start testing my templates. Does that make sense? Okay, so let's do a little exercise together. And in order to do this, we're going to go ahead and just get the starter code now. So open up a terminal, and I'm going to CD to go to my home directory, and then I'm going to CD into documents. Okay. And as always, there are instructions for this in the repo if you need help following along. I'm then going to change into JS-DC2, CD into JSD2. And here I'm in the class repository. I'm going to go ahead and git pull to get the latest result, get the latest updates. Looks like there's a bunch of them. Okay. Once we got the latest results, I'm going to CD up one level, back into documents, CD dot. And now that I'm in documents, I'm going to make a new directory, make dir. And it's going to be inside of Jacob's JS repo. And I'm going to call it class 14. That's today, class 14. And now that I have that new folder, I'm going to go ahead and copy cp-r files from the from the class repository, JSDC2 14- Firebase starter code. and I'm going to copy that to Jacob's JS repo, class 14. Now that I've copied those files, I'm going to cd into that directory, into Jacob's JS repo, class 14, starter code. And then I'm going to subble dot to open this in Sublime. Yep.
Is that a t-shirt for your own company?
Yeah, it is.
Nice.
I have probably 15 t-shirts from my own company. All right. So we're now in the starter code, and there's a file in here, hwreview.js, and this is where we're going to be working. However, there's a prettier version of this that I'm going to show up here on the big board for a second while we talk about it. So I'm going to go into a class. Okay. All right, so we're going to just look at number one right now. So we're just going to look at number one. We're going to talk about one thing from the hints. We'll do one of these, and we'll talk about that and go to the next thing. So that's sort of the format. We're going to do number one. Given the following API, so this is a part of the API documentation. Okay, so it's some endpoints, some HTTP request methods, paths, and the resulting response bodies when we make those requests. Based on these, we want to construct a model object that holds all the data that we might need from these APIs. Okay? So what we want to do is make a mock model with fake data, just like we had in that hint number one, that holds the data that may come back from this API. Okay? So that's what we want to do. We want to create one model object, just like we had in hint number one, that can hold some of this information that's coming back from this API. Okay? So we want to construct a model given that we know the API looks like this. Okay, I said that like 10 different ways. All right, so go ahead and give this a shot. The same prompt is in the JavaScript file. It just looks a little prettier here, so I showed it up here. Okay, so we have these three endpoints that are described by this API, and we want to create a model that can contain the data here. And we want to put some fake data, some mock data into that model so that we can use it to create some templates. No worries. Did you make a passcode when you made your SSH key?
If I did,
Okay.
Why did it do that when it hasn't asked for us?
Well, it might have just cached it for a while, and now it's like,
Okay, maybe I did make some password. Okay, so it's just whatever I did.
yeah, give it a shot, and if not, there's ways to fix it. So
I was
let
like,
me know if we could either change your SSH key or we could switch it to use HTTPS instead. Yeah. So
Okay, all right.
if that doesn't work, there's still hope.
That wasn't the part I was expecting to
And feel free, by the way, in all of these exercises throughout today, feel free to work with the people near you and discuss, your option.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have all of it in the prompt, in the JavaScript. And by the way, the JavaScript file, we're not actually going to run that. It's just a place to kind of scratch work, to write our little snippets. So don't worry about document readies or anything.
Yeah, it's at the comments.
Yeah, there's like space in between the comments where you can put it. We're not like building the whole application, we're just doing little snippets.
You must be dummy data?
Yes. What we're doing is constructing a mock model that we can use to do templates down the road. Actual fake data. Yes.
I just put a picture of Phil on my laptop, and then I kept tabbing between that and a large heart. So it was just like Phil heart, Phil heart.
I love that. Okay, I'm going to start doing my example. Okay, so we've got these 3 endpoints here, right? We've got one where we log in, and it gives us, as a result, some object containing an access token. Okay, you know, in our lab, the login function gave us like a user ID, and that's what we used to make our subsequent request, was this user ID that came from login. You know, other applications may give you instead something like an access token, which you use to make your subsequent requests. Okay, so the requests that come after login. There's a scores endpoint here that has like an array of objects. Each of those objects has a few things in it, and finally there's a get current game that gives just one object that has, you know, some information about whatever the current game is. Okay, so you know, if I'm constructing a model for this, well, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create just a variable here. We'll call it model, and you know, I said that the model should be an object. And so we're going to make it an object here. Okay. So what keys did you have in your object? What keys did we have in your object? Yeah. Okay. Had a token key. Hey, what others? Scores key. Okay. And what else? Okay, current game. Perfect. I mean, this is exactly what I would have done. So these are the keys in our object. And so let's take a look now. Okay, so what values can we expect the API to produce? Well, the token, it looks like, is just a string. So let's just put that string directly right into our fake model. Okay. Use the comma there. All right, and the scores. Well, we know that the scores, when they come back from the API, is going to be an array of objects, and the objects will be shaped like this. I'm just going to take this right from the API docs and copy it and put it into my model, my fake model. And I'll highlight it all and tab it over so it looks nice. Add a comma there. Okay, so now my model has the token that we can use. It has some scores that we'll probably use for rendering, right? Some scores to display on the page. And finally, if I'm going to add to the model the current game, well, let's go ahead and take that from the API as well. And I'm going to tab that over. Okay. So now we have a fully realized mock model. Okay, this is all the data that we could potentially need in our application. And if we want to try some other things, like what happens if there's 3 scores instead of 2, well, we could just add some more fake data into our model and experiment with it that way. Okay. Any questions about this constructing of the fake model here? So when we're doing this templating, it's really helpful to do this sort of exercise so you can see, you know, how does the model affect the template. And you can test how changing things in the model changes things in the user interface and whether or not that behaves the way you expect it to. Question?
Yes. But the key pair, I mean, does it have to be in quotation? Does it have to be a string?
Oh no, so remember that keys really are strings.
Yeah.
But when we write them in JavaScript, we can get rid of these quotes. I just left them in because I copied it right from the API docs, but I could totally get rid of them on the keys.
Is it good form to get rid of them, or does it you just see it written both ways?
Well, remember that this data is only in here temporarily while we're developing the application, so we're not really concerned about form either way. However, I will say that most typically you'll see no quotes on keys. Yeah. So if you looked at the hints as I sent them out, which I hope you did, you'll notice that when we went from hint number 1 to hint number 2, what happened to the model? I was going to pull it up, but only if anybody knows. What happened when we went from the first hint to the second hint? What happened to this model in the code? Yeah.
Just had the array tokens.
Exactly. So when I went from the first model, the first hint, which is when I was working on the templates, right? When I was working on the templates, building those out, I had all this fake data in there. The second hint, I was starting to integrate with the HTTP API, right? I was starting to make those AJAX calls and loading the real data, okay? And so once I'm to that point in my application, I'm pretty confident in my model, my templates. Once I'm at that point, then I'll go ahead and just remove this fake data. So maybe I'll make this an empty string or undefined even. It's probably good. And then the scores, maybe I'll make this instead of being an array with fake data, I'll just make it an empty array. So array with nothing in it until we go and actually get the real data from the API. And maybe I'll have this object, it could be just like an empty object, or maybe I'll make it undefined as well. Okay, so when I went from hint 1 to hint 2, you saw this happen, right? The model went from having a bunch of fake-looking data in there to being something like this, where it's just got some keys in it, basically, outlining, this is how the model's going to look. Does that make sense? Because what we're going to do at that next step is we're going to actually start going to get real data and adding it to the model. Yes?
Can't you just say scores as undefined?
You could. I mean, it depends on what assumptions the rest of your application makes about the types of things, right? But yeah, they could all just be undefined if you wanted to. It's personal choice generally. You're probably not going to use them until you load the real data anyway, right? So it doesn't really matter what the values are at the beginning. Okay, I'm going to put this back since that was what the question asked us to do. All right. So let's go back to hint number 1, and let's look briefly at the templates there. So can I get back there? Okay, so here we are at hint number 1. We've got, just like we just did, right? This model here with all of this data based on what we know is coming back from the API. One of the tricks here was knowing what data we needed from that API and what data we didn't really need to store in here. Like for instance, the thing that comes from the interests endpoint, we didn't have to store that in there because basically we had everything we needed here in the categories. And the categories say whether or not the user has selected them based on their interest. Yeah.
If I'm pulling from an API, let's say a Twitter API, how much data will it send me? Do I have to control the flow of data coming into the application? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. So say you are asking for all the tweets containing the word, McDonald's or whatever it is, right? You do like a API request querying some term, right, to Twitter. There's going to probably be a default limit of tweets that they're going to send you. So they'll probably be like 100 tweets or something by default. And you could potentially use a query parameter to make that higher or lower based on the needs of your application. So yeah, it's very much up to you, but there probably is some sort of default number that's manageable in your application. Does that make sense? Yeah. And you know, that's going to differ.
Well, it's a concern of mine, I work with it all the time, so when I don't use JSON, I use IC or whatever, so if I.
You put like a limit on
You
there.
never know what you're gonna-
Yeah. So these APIs will have sensible limits because they know people are going to abuse them, right? So they'll have sensible limits of something like, say, 100 or maybe 1,000 tweets. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's going to differ from API to API based on, you know, what they decide to do on their end. They could implement it however they
What
want.
are tests that we're building, like, what degree of the APIs or by like, right, just the application. Like, should I be trying to actually use, like, I mean, this is probably going on for the class, but should I use Firebase or persistence and that on the API? Like, how's that? I don't use a lot of APIs.
Sure. So if you're using something like Firebase, it's going to require that the browser be authenticated in order to make API requests. So generally, it won't matter. You know, what you won't have to control for any of those things because Firebase is going to protect against unauthorized requests. So you know, unless somebody gets in there and does some really weird things in their JavaScript console, you know, you should be all right. But anyway, that's Firebase's concerns, not yours. Okay, all right, so getting back to it, so here we are, we have this model, we've got this fake data in here. One thing I did want to mention, here's this, where we're compiling these templates. This is maybe a little bit different than we've seen it thus far. I put all of notice we had 3 templates, if you've looked at these hints, which hopefully you have. We had one for that top login portion, we had one for the category spans that come below that, and one for the articles that come below that. So 3 different templates, so we can kind of separate the different parts of our UI and make them a little bit independent of each other. So in order to have 3 different templates, we need 3 different template functions, right? And we create those template functions by using handlebars.compile. So we get the source of the login template and we compile it to create the login template function. We get the source of the category template to compile a category template function, etc. Right? And I wrapped them all in this function here and made the template functions global variables. And the reason I did that is because I only need to compile these once. I only need to compile them one time. So when we first started, we were doing it here right in the render function, right? Right before we actually rendered the template, we would do it as the first step of this function. But it turns out we don't have to do it every time we render, because that may happen many times throughout the application's lifecycle. We only really need to do it once. So we can do it at the beginning when the application first loads and then be done with it. And so I put it all in this compile templates function. And if you notice down here in setup, the first thing that the setup function does is compile those templates. Okay? So small efficiency gain probably wouldn't have really mattered for this application, but as your applications get bigger and bigger, you know, that might be something that you want to think about. Okay, so we do have 3 templates, so let's take a look at those. Specifically, let's look at the articles one. I think it's probably the most interesting of these. And we've got several things happening here. So we saw conditionals in class in templates, but we use those conditionals for a class name, an attribute class name, right? That's how we were using the conditional, much like this, right? So here we have this label, and if the selected property is true, add this label primary class. Else, add this label default class. And that's how we used it when we did it in class. Turns out you can use that for actually whole chunks of your template. So whole chunks of HTML can be encapsulated in these conditional statements. So what you see here in this article template is we're surrounding the whole template with this if statement. And we're saying if the thing at the key logged in is true, then render this template. Else, this template will be empty when rendered. So it's not going to show any articles at all until you're logged in, okay? Until that logged in Boolean is true. Right? And that's why when we first load this page, we don't see anything on the page when we first get there. Even if we were to render this template, nothing would come back because that logged in Boolean is false. Yes?
how does the if statement know if you're referring to something in your model, like logged in, or if you're referring to a CSS class?
Great. So it's always, the if statement here always is referring to something, a key in the object that was passed in. Always referring to a key in the object that was passed in. So when I write this if, I'm saying if the value at the key logged in for the object passed in is true. Okay? It always means that. So if we look at what we pass into this template, this is the articles template. We're passing in our model object from the top, exactly. So if we look at this object, it's looking at this key here. Since we're passing in this object, it's going to find this key logged in. It's going to say, oh, the value is true. I'm going to actually render this stuff. Okay. So the keys in our template have to match, necessarily must match, the keys in the object that we pass in.
So it's not CSS class.
No. We can use, like we do here, we can use this to render or not render CSS classes, but this selected here, if selected, this selected is a key in the object that it's looking at, right?
It's a key in the object model.
So it's a key in one of these categories.
In the
Yeah. But skipping one step ahead, because we haven't talked about that each yet, but yes, that's looking at that key here, the selected key. All right, so if we look at the next thing going on here, so we now know this if is used to look at a key and say if that key is true or truthy, render the stuff inside of this conditional. The other thing that's going on here is this each. So this each is interesting. This is how we can create a loop within our template. Okay? So this is creating a loop within our template. And what this is saying is find the value at the key articles. Okay? So find the value at the key articles. So let's take a look at that. So we know we passed in this whole model object. So let's find the key articles. Okay, here's the key articles. And the value there is this array of articles. Okay? So the only reason this each works is because this key matches this key. Okay? If we had changed one or the other, it would not work any longer. Okay? It's saying find that value there, and then render this for each thing in that array. Okay, so we're going to render this HTML for each thing in that array. So if we look in that array, each thing in there is an object. Okay? Each article is an object, and that object has its own keys. Okay? So now that we're inside of this each, we can refer to the keys of the individual article object. So here we have an image. This image URL must match a key in one of those objects. So if we look back here at the model, you'll notice this object has an image URL key. And that's the only reason why this works, is because these keys match each other, right? If we passed in an object with a different shape, we got different keys, this would no longer work. Right? So the template is looking for those keys in those objects. Okay? So really, everything else is pretty much just like we talked about before. So each one of these is a key in the article object, including this one, which is a Boolean. We're saying if this is bookmarked, we're going to render the span that says bookmarked. Okay. Questions about this? We're going to do another little exercise related to this. But before we do, are there any questions? Okay, so let's look at number 2 on this little review exercise. Let me make the font bigger. Okay, so using that fake model that we constructed in question 1, right? So we made that fake model in question 1. Using that, we want to create a template that can render this HTML. Okay? So just like when we started the lab, we were given some mock HTML. Imagine this is some mock HTML. We want to create a template that can take that model object HTML. Okay, so go ahead and try that on your own. And note that it says we only want to render this if the user is logged in. In other words, if the user has a token. And like I said, we're just writing snippets of code here, so you don't need to make like an HTML file and all that stuff. Just write it directly, below the comment. Just add it. It's technically not, but it acts like it, right? We'll look at exactly what it looks like. Okay, I'm going to start doing it up here. If you're almost done, feel free to finish. Okay, so let's go back to this. Here. All right, so we've got this model. Just as a review, this model has 3 keys: the token, the scores, and the current game. Okay, and what we want to do is be able to have a template that can take that model and create this HTML. Okay, so first thing we have to do is create that script tag and give it an ID. We'll call it standings template. And we'll have to give it the type which is text, I believe it's text X handlebars template. We could have, I mean, you know, that this is not the hard part of this exercise, obviously, so you could have left that off. I don't really care. Okay. So in here is where we're going to create our template. The first thing we want to know is, ooh, yeah, script is spelled wrong. The first thing we need to know is, is this user logged in? So if they're logged in, we want to show them these standings. Else, we're not going to show them anything, right? So the way we're going to do that is we're going to wrap our entire template in a conditional. And the way we create a conditional in the template is with if. Now, what can we use to tell if the user is logged in? What in our model can tell us if the user is logged in? Yeah. Yeah, if they have a token, right? Okay, exactly right. Now, if we start that token off as an empty string or undefined, are those two values truthy or falsy? Empty string and undefined, are those truthy or falsy? They're falsy, yes. So an empty string is falsy, undefined is falsy. So if we start them off with an empty string or undefined, then we can say that's a proxy for they're not logged in yet, right? They haven't gotten a token yet, they're not logged in yet. So we can just say if token, oops, not taken, token. I think that's the key. Yep, and we know it's got to match this key. All right, so once they have a token and it's this non-empty string, that's truthy, and so this conditional will evaluate to true. So we're going to have that, and then we have to end the if down here. Okay, so all of the HTML that we're going to write is going to go in here. Okay. Now, next thing you notice is on the outside of this is a UL. Okay, so let's go ahead and just create that UL in the template. And I'll make the open tag and then the close tag. Now, how many list items am I going to need in this template? How many list items do I need? Yeah, why is that? Right. In our fake data, our array has 2 scores.
Yeah.
But we don't know that it will always have 2 scores, right? It may have 2, it may have 2,000, right? We don't really know ahead of time how many things will be in that array. So we need to create a template that can render 1, 2, or 2,000, and anything in between different scores in our standings. And so what technique can we use to do that we saw in the hint number 1? Right, we can do a loop in our template using each.
This is just handlebars.
This is just handlebars, yeah. Okay, so I know I'm going to use this each. And I got to end the each down here. So what do I put right here after each?
Score.
I put score, singular or plural? Scores, okay? So what matters here is we need to tell it the key where the array that we want to loop through lives, okay? So this key has the array as a value. And so that's what we're going to put after our each, is that key where the array lives in the model. Okay? So down here, we're going to put each scores. Okay? And now that we're inside of this each loop here in our template, now that we're inside of there, we can use the keys in these objects. Okay? So each time we render this part of our template, we're going to have one of these objects to work with. And so we can now use these keys, the individual list items here, in this part of our template. So within inside of this each loop. Okay? So we know for each of them, we want to create a list item. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this. I have to uncomment it. Okay. Well, let's do the easy stuff first. Obviously, I don't want each list item to say John, right? That wouldn't be exactly what I want. What do I want it to say here instead in my template? I heard somebody say it. We're going to use the curly braces, which say, this is dynamic data, this is a placeholder, and we want to put in there the thing at the key user, right? Because if we look back at our model, once again, each of these objects in the scores array has a key user. Okay? And that's what we want to put there in the name portion of this. Okay. Now, every user obviously isn't going to have 14 points. Okay, so this is another piece of dynamic data here that needs to change from list item to list item. So what should we replace here, and with what? Anybody want to help out? And what do we want to replace? So we want to replace all of 14 points? Right. So the only thing that changes from one to the next is the number, right? Each one should say points, and so we'll put here points, right? And the reason we put points is because this point matches the points key in this object. And finally, not every list item has this winning class, only the one that has the winning key true. Okay? So since we want to conditionally have that class on this list item, once again, we're going to use a conditional right here. So I'll use if, and the name of the key is also winning, right? Here we're using the name of the key in that object. Right? So the name of the key up here in this object is winning. If that key is true, we will add that winning class, and if not, we'll add nothing. The coloring's a little messed up because Sublime thinks this is a JavaScript file, but. All right, any questions about building this template?
I think when you do it, like, makes sense than when I try to look at it, it's different.
Because I am talking you through, step by step. It's something you'll have to practice, right? Writing it on your own over and over and over until finally it clicks. Okay. But the important thing to remember here is that the keys have to match the object that you're passing into this template, right? That's the important thing. Yeah.
So it's saying if you're winning, we'll add the class of winning. So if you're losing, then there will be no class.
Right. It'll look like this. If you're winning, it'll put this class winning in there. If not, it'll look like this. Right? It'll just remove that whole portion of the template.
Would it do the same thing if you wrapped the if statement around the whole class?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, you could totally do, because there's only one class here, we could totally put the if statement all the way outside of the class if we wanted to. Like that. And then the list item would just not have this class at all.
So the first way allows for.
Yeah, like if we had another class in there and we just wanted to add the winning class in addition, then we would have to do it the first way. Like this. So we could have another one like score or something, and then in addition to this, it may or may not have the winning class. Exactly. Okay. Let's go ahead and go straight to the next one real quick because we've already kind of talked about this. So this one says, attach a fictional event listener to the buttons in the created template. Okay, so in this template here, notice there's a button. what we're going to do for number 3 is we're just going to attach a fictional event listener function to those buttons. Okay, so what would we write in our setup function in order to attach event listener to those buttons from that template? Okay, and the job of this event listener function would be, it's fictional, but the job would be to update the score. Okay, so what would we write in our setup function in order to attach event listeners to these buttons in this template? Okay, so go ahead and give that a shot on your own. I should say the event we care about, I didn't specify in the question, but the event we care about is the click event. So we're attaching a click event listener. Okay, can anybody tell me what jQuery function we use to attach an event listener? Right, the one we've used in this class is .on, right? jQuery .on, okay? That's absolutely right. So the first thing we're gonna do is, well, we need to find those buttons on the page. Well, we know the buttons, if we look at them, have a class +1. So we can use that class as a CSX selector. And we can use jQuery's .on function to attach an event listener. What's the first argument that we pass to .on? Click, right? The name of the event as a string. And what is the second? I'm going to go ahead and comment this out because it's messing up my colors. There we go. And what is the second argument that we pass to that .on? A function, right? The function that responds to this click event. Okay? And so, in this situation, what should we call this function? Yeah, let's just call it update score. Right? Told you to attach a fictional event listener. So this is update score. We haven't defined it, but that's okay. It's fictional. We might define it later. Question?
So the button's inside the script, right? So it's not necessarily in the document.
Wonderful. Exactly. Right. You got it. That's where I was going with this. Right. These buttons are inside of this template, which means when the page first loads, those buttons aren't yet in the HTML, which means we can't actually directly bind an event listener to those buttons because they're not there yet. Okay? So how can we change this in order to make it work in this scenario?
So do body, then on click, and then you're gonna add another parameter and do class plus one.
Okay. Right. Can anybody tell me why he said do body?
Okay.
So he said change this to body. And move the CSS selector we care about there. Why is that?
I think it's because we don't know what the other HTML is yet.
Exactly.
There's gotta be like,
Oh, the standings won't even show up either.
Exactly, right? Standings is part of the template as well. We actually don't know we have no idea what the rest of the HTML looks like. I didn't give that to you. But one thing we're guaranteed of is there's gonna be a body tag, right? So we know that this body tag will be there. So we could just attach the event listener to that and delegate it for the +1 button. Yeah.
theoretically, you can always display using delegate listener with body and theoretical child body.
Absolutely. Yeah, so theoretically, we could always use body for a delegated listening, right? Because every event is eventually going to get to body. Every user-initiated event will eventually get to body. That actually might not be true of like a window resize or some events like that, but for any like HTML element event, this is true. Now, it's not always the best because what this does is it has to check this for every event that happens. It has to check to make sure that this isn't the case. So the further we can go down, the better. But this will always work. Okay, and in this scenario, this is all we know. So it was our only option. Okay, it's been about an hour, so let's go ahead and take a quick break, and then we'll get into finishing up the review of the lab.
I actually have a question that's relevant.
Okay.
Handlebars. So I'm trying to create a handlebars template, and so I put this into my model here, right there, tweets, right there. Now, will handlebars handle? This is my question. So I want to get their user and then there's the name. Well, so this is under all about tweets. So I know it'll recognize users. This example does the first level. Will it do second level keys?
I'm sure it does. I'm just not sure what syntax is. But I'm sure it does.
Handlebars.
Nested. Try it and just see what that
Here we go.
Yeah. So you can just do that.
Oh, so it just accepts that.
Yeah, apparently so.
Well then, sir.
There you go.
Well then. Told you. I can actually.
Scissors take a while.
We can probably fix it real quick.
Okay.
So you
I
couldn't
still
get to it.
know.
Okay, so let's there's two ways. The easier way is probably to just change it from using SSH to HTTPS. So we'll probably do that in a second. So go to your just use one last thing. So can you navigate to your these are the ones that you're trying to oh, I guess it's the class one.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Cold or perfect?
Okay, well we can switch it. So you have a okay. So what I'm going to do is here, there's always two options. You can see the SSH option and HTTPS option. I think that's it's saying right now, the origin for this project is to get that
I should have
yeah.
I was trying to do the Jackson notation.
Alright. Origin. Add it back.
Do it. Gotta do it somehow.
Like, we need to fix like the other ones.
If they prompt you, okay, so if you just exactly your
Thanks, Mary.
And so it shouldn't be
Don't
that.
judge me. I don't judge
Yeah,
you.
Show me your
I'm being a golf player, which is
or
very
you have to
judgeable.
generate the USSH go put it in it. So it takes a little bit longer.
I just imagine you rolling around on golf.
I was not expecting that.
With a cigar in your mouth.
Thank you.
No problem.
Like one of the big studies too. We're talking like huge right here.
Oh, we're almost all back. I'm gonna close it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and get started. It's been a while. All right, so here I am now in hint number 2. Okay, so we're now here in hint number 2, and like I mentioned earlier, we've gone from this fully fleshed out model with a bunch of fake data in it to now I've sort of removed all that, and I've got just sort of empty strings, empty arrays, false. And I could have probably made those like undefined or whatever it was. But I'm just kind of leaving those keys there so I can see the shape of the model. Obviously, I'm going to initiate logged in at false because when we first load the application, it's not logged in. But what this signals is we're now loading real data. We're prepared to load real data from the HTTP API. Okay? So let's scroll down. None of this changed, right? This view layer is done. That was what hint number 1 was all of our templates and our view component here is all complete at this point in time. So what did change? Well, a couple things. One, we've now got these event listeners, right? And once again, these are delegated event listeners, right? Because basically everything on this page is rendered from a template, and thus we're not 100% sure when it's going to be there. And so we're going to create this delegated event listener. We know this login container ID is there when the page first loads, and thus we can attach that to that. But what we really care about is something that's inside of there, the login submit button. Okay. And when that happens, we're going to run this function login. Okay. So this function login is what we would call an event listener function, right? This login function is waiting for that click event to occur. Okay. So down here, we've got our login event listener. Okay, so this is where it really starts to get interesting. Okay. So what are we doing when we log in? Well, generally speaking, what we're doing is we're making an AJAX call, an API call to the login endpoint. Okay. So if we look at our API documentation, the first thing we see in this API documentation is that there is a post endpoint /login that requires a username, body, and returns as a response an object with a user ID in it. Okay? So when we log in, the process of logging in is done by making this AJAX request. Okay? So that's really what this is. And after this AJAX request has completed, we will update our model to signify that we are now logged in. Okay? So really the process of logging in is making an API request or an AJAX request to this post login endpoint. Okay, so let's look back at the code.
How can we use post versus AJAX there?
Oh, so why did I use .post here in the code instead of AJAX? I could have used either. I just chose to use post here because we hadn't talked about it explicitly in class other than just mentioning that it existed, and so I wanted you to see what it looked like. But I could have used either. Yeah.
If you did the AJAX method, would it have the success? Like what success means?
We will look at that in a second. I'm going to have you translate from one to the other, and we'll talk about that specifically. So the first thing we do, though, in this login is we're going to get that username that the user typed into the field, into the input element username, right? So if we look, once again, just tying it all together, if we look back at our template for the login portion, you'll notice it has an input that has an ID username. And thus we can extract the value that the user's typed into that username by using jQuery's .val. That's how we get a value the user's input. And we're going to, yeah. And sometimes we don't have IDs on inputs. You could also use like the name or a class and whatever you want to do. But in this case, I put an ID on there so that I could target it very specifically here in this function. Okay, so I get that username out of there. I store it in this username variable here. And then I use jQuery.post to make an AJAX post request to some URL. Okay? So when I'm using jQuery.post, it takes 3 parameters. The first is the URL. In this case, we know that's /login. Okay. And the reason we can just put /login instead of http://localhost3010/login, the reason we can put /login instead of all of that is because we're on the same domain. We're on the same URL here, so this is relative to the page where this is running. Right? So since we're loading this page from HTTP localhost 3010, this is the same as saying, oops. Right. But since we're on the same, since the page that we're working on is the same, has the same first part as this URL, we can get rid of that portion. Okay, so this is just a relative URL now instead of a fully qualified URL. Okay, the second parameter that post takes is a data object. Okay, so some data object. Okay, so how did I come up with this object that has a key username and a value entered username, which is the thing that the user entered? How did I come up with that object to pass as the data? Well, the reason I know that I need this key username in this object is because the API docs tell me I need an object with a key username. Request body needs to have this object with a key username. So that's how I knew to make the object, the data object, look like this. So it has to match what the API expects it to look like. Okay, this third argument is what? Can anybody tell me what the third argument to .post is? Yeah. It's what? Yeah, that's what it does, but what is it? What is the third argument to the .post function? Right, it's an anonymous function. Sometimes we refer to this function as a callback, right? Sometimes we refer to this as a callback. And what's the role of a callback function? Yeah.
For the async to get, because it's an async function.
Exactly. Exactly. So what we talked about last week is that $.post is asynchronous. AJAX requests are what we call asynchronous. That means the next line of code, in this case, if there's something down here at line 64, the next line of code can run before this line has finished. Okay? So the code can continue running before this line has finished. So if we put something here on 64, we put code right here on line 64, this line will run before line 57 has finished. Because line 57 is asynchronous. Okay? So if you say like this is all one, basically one function call here, this is asynchronous. So this will not be done when we get here. Yeah.
Will line 67 run before?
Line 67, this line right here, is defining this function. This line will run as soon as the file loads. Line 68, this line won't run until the event that triggers this toggle interest function happens. Okay, so if you notice this toggle interest function, that's only called when one of those spans inside of categories is clicked on. So line 68 here won't happen until somebody clicks on one of those categories. Yeah, exactly. And at this point, there's no categories there to show, so that necessarily must happen later on.
Sorry, is there a way, now, there's a way to have on login for all the arguments?
If the API provides an endpoint that does that,
Does it?
it does not.
Why not?
Because this API only gives you your feed, so it only gives you articles that you're interested in.
That's why it's, I was trying to load all the interests and then have the users limits.
You can load all the categories.
So yeah, how do I load all the categories and have to make them all toggle instead of loading?
Well, we
we
can
see this was my question. Your argument for the default versus not default. Like this threw me for a loop. So
how do you show like
something when someone logs in there, it has to show something.
right? So this
Some articles, not just the categories. I want to see categories and 3 or 4 articles. If it's my first log.
well, okay, that's not how this application works. Yeah, I mean, if we wrote it that way, if we wrote the backend that way, then it would work that way. But that's not how this was written.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's back to the matter at hand here. This callback function, this is necessary because inside of that function is the only place where we know this AJAX request has completed. Okay, so this callback function will not be called until this AJAX post request has completed. Okay. So we can't put something on line 64 that we want to happen after the AJAX request, because at that point it's only been initiated, it's only been started, it hasn't completed yet. The only way we know it's been completed, and the only way we can get access to the response to that AJAX request, is inside of this callback. Okay. So here, when we have a callback function, this callback will get called, this function will be called when the AJAX request completes, and the parameter here will be the response body from that API. Okay? So if we look back at the API documentation, the response body is this object that has a user ID key. So in that callback function for this post request, data will be this object. Okay? It'll be the data that we get in response to that call. So what are we going to do inside of this callback function? Well, we're going to update our model. Because now we know that AJAX request has completed. We know that the user has logged in. And so we're going to update the model's username. We're just going to put in that username that they entered up here. We're going to update the user ID. We're going to grab that from the data object. So remember, that data object only has one key in it, and that's the user ID. And so we'll get that user ID from there. And we're just going to say logged in is now equal to true. So now we've updated the model. Okay. Questions about this so far? All right, let's turn back to the example code, the review questions up here. This number 4, and actually let me pull up the nice looking version. Number 4 here is asking you to write an AJAX request to send and receive fake data to the following endpoint and log the response body's status. Okay, so once again, I've given you a mock API doc for a single endpoint here, a put to some path. This is the request body that expects. Here's the response body that requests. Now, try to, on your own, try to write an AJAX request that can work with this endpoint. Actually, pretend this says post. Pretend this is a post request. I meant to put post, and I didn't. So instead of a put, say this is a post. Oh yeah, it is dark. Let there be light. That's, yeah, the new one.
Can't figure out why this is not working. So, set up my model here. This is pretty simple. Each tweets that you put in.
Because when you're inside of each,
Yeah.
you start at the individual object. Right? So you don't even repeat tweets. So once you're inside that tweets array,
So it starts at user.
it starts at user. You start at that individual item.
So I actually start here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like this is well. So each tweet, I assume, has a user key.
Yeah. Is that a name key? Oh, I didn't. You wouldn't. I tried looking at the past example, so you wouldn't get that.
Yeah, well, that's why I mentioned it in the.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, there it goes.
Okay. Let's give you a few more seconds. All right. So we're just going to basically do what we just saw, right? We're going to do a post AJAX request using post method. And we're going to use that to interact with this fake endpoint here that we've kind of mimicked up there. So first of all, we're going to use jQuery.post. Remember, there are these shorthand versions for get and post. There's not one for put or delete, which is why I changed that to put post. So this takes 3 arguments, right? The first one is the URL. So if we look back here, what URL do we need? Well, it wants /username/score. And what we talked about when we first were talking about APIs is this with the colon preceding it. This often means this part of the path is variable, right? So it's not literally going to say :username. It's going to say a username, right? So it might say Jacob or John or Bill or Jane or whatever the username might be, right? So that colon there means that part of the path is actually variable. So that's going to change. So in our fake request, we'll just make up a username. So we're going to make the request to Jacob / what was it? I've already forgotten. Score. Okay, so that's the URL. Remember, we're just doing fake data here, so fake username is also fine. Now, if this were a real application, this would probably be like a variable, right? Or part of our model or something. So we might do like this plus some variable plus this. Maybe this says like username. We could have done that to be a little more realistic, but in this situation, we're just going to put Jacob right in there. Use fake data. The second argument here is the data object that we want to send, that we want to post to this endpoint. So looking back at the documentation, we can see that it wants an object that has 1 key, points, and the value of that should be some number. Remember, in this API documentation, the keys will probably be real. The keys will be real. The values may be just examples, dummy data. Okay, so let's go and create an object here that has this points key. And we're going to say 20, fake data. Finally, it wants us to log to the console the response body's status. So again, the third parameter here is a function, a callback function. We'll make it, in this case, we'll just make it an anonymous function. We'll give it a parameter data. And what we know about that data is that it is this response object that comes back from this API request. Right? So here, this API documentation specifies that the response body will look like this. And so in our callback function, that data parameter becomes this object, whatever the API request resulted in. So we can see it has two keys. The first one is status. The second one is points. So in order to log the status, we will access console.log. And what will I put in there? Exactly. Data.status, right? Data is that object. It has a key status. We access that key by using dot notation. And then if this were the real application, we'd probably go and update our model as well, or something like that. Well, yeah, this one would be tricky because we don't actually have a way to go find it in the model. So, hopefully what it would give us back instead of this is the whole list of updated scores that we could just put in there, or we could just make a new request to scores and get the updated ones from that endpoint, from the get endpoint.
So you don't need the model sometimes.
Yeah, so sometimes we don't really care about the response. Yeah. So in this case, this is a good point to make. In this case, since we know that this API, this fictional API, has this get endpoint /scores, right? Well, we know we've updated the scores in some way, but our model doesn't have an easy way to just plug that in there. So instead of trying to plug that result, that data result in there, we could just, after that post happens, make a get request to /scores. Remember, the .get only has two parameters. The first is the URL. The second is the callback function. When we're getting something, we're often not sending data. Generally speaking, we don't send data in GET requests. We're just asking to read it. And thus, for a GET request, we have two, the scores. And the function here, well, we're going to give it a different name. So I'll call this one score data. And then here, we could update our model. Model.scores, right? We know it has that scores key, equals score data. Now, notice where I put this updating the scores. I put it inside of the callback function. If I had put it here, would it have behaved the way we wanted it to? Would this still work? You're shaking your head? Explain.
It might run before the data.
Exactly right. This post function, when we get to line 125, has not completed yet. We don't know that it's completed. In fact, it probably has not. And so we're going to try to get these scores and refresh them before we've even finished updating them. And thus, we won't probably see those updates when we get them down here. Yeah?
So do we put any function that depends on that inside those brackets?
Correct. Anything that depends on this update being complete must necessarily happen inside of the callback.
So is callback hell when you have too much stuff going?
Right. Imagine if you have 10 API requests that have to happen one after the other. Callback hell would be like, okay, in this one, then make another GET request, and then another post, and then another post, right? There are ways to reformat your code so that it doesn't quite look that bad, but generally speaking, yeah, that happens sometimes. Yeah.
Silly question, I guess. How is the get function dependent on the post function in this instance?
It's not silly. How is it dependent?
Yeah.
Because what we're doing here is we're updating a score, right? And so we expect it to change the result of the scores endpoint, right? So when we update an individual score, when we get other things, those changes might proliferate around to different parts of the model.
I didn't see. Yeah. Okay.
You'll find this every time you work with an API. It's not going to be immediately obvious what one change will have, what effects it will have in other parts of the models. Sometimes you just kind of have to experiment with it. Is something we're talking about? Oh, my phone came on.
Probably answered this already, but so you can use post to update something
Post, remember,
instead of put.
is to create. In this case, we should have used put, but I just wanted to use post because put doesn't have a shorthand. But you're right, semantically in this case, the putting would be the right thing because we're updating a score. But yes, question?
I was just curious, like with models and score, how come because points is inside of scores, you wouldn't do model.scores.
Well, remember, what is scores? What value is stored in scores? Right, so can we access items in an array with dot notation? No. So we'd have to know the index of the one that we're updating, which is we don't necessarily have at that point.
So then how does it know to update points? It just assumes.
No, what we're doing here is we're reloading all of the scores, and we're just replacing that whole array with the updated array. Wiping it out, starting again. Absolutely. Okay, let's do this last exercise here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send the solution to the lab tonight, the whole solution, and we'll do a little bit more review on Thursday. But I do want to get into this Firebase stuff, so I don't want to drag it out too long. But let's do this number 5. And what this is asking you to do is to take this post request and translate this into a .ajax request. Okay? So here we have this post request. We want to do the exact same thing with a .ajax request. Okay, so try it on your own first. All right. So where jQuery.post takes 3 arguments, how many arguments does jQuery.ajax take? So typically when we use jQuery.ajax, we pass in 1 argument. Okay? So we pass in 1 argument, and that argument is a object that has a bunch of configuration settings for that AJAX request. Right? So it's important to think about things in that way, right? Here we have 3 separate arguments. One's called game. We have an object here, a new game. That's the data we're posting in this situation. And finally, we have a callback function as the 3rd argument. When we translate this to use jQuery.ajax, instead of having those 3 separate arguments, we're just going to give it a single argument, and that argument is an object itself. Okay? And we need to give, in this object, we need to add some options. What's one option, or one key that we add to this object? Okay, type, exactly. And what type should we put? Right, we're going to use the post type, right? This is a post HTTP request. So since there's no shorthand for put and delete, if we need to do a put or delete request, we'd necessarily have to use jQuery.ajax instead of anything else, because it's the only one capable. Okay, what other keys should we put in this object? URL, right? And what should the URL be? /game, right? Taking the URL, that's the first one here. Okay, what other keys do we need? Yeah, we need a success key, okay? And this success key, that means the success callback. In other words, the callback that gets called when the AJAX request completes successfully. Okay, so that's why that key is success. It means the success callback, the thing to call when the AJAX request completes successfully. Well, we already know what the callback is. It's this third argument up here. So I'm just going to copy that. And I'm going to make it the value of that key. I'll have to uncomment those out and tab them over. Okay, we need one more key here. We've almost finished. We need one more key. Does anybody know what that one is? Yeah, exactly. The final key that we need is data, because we need a way to actually post this data object from the original post request. And there, we'll put that object directly. That's the thought.
From a notation perspective, does the success function, success key, it goes very bottom of the page?
It doesn't actually matter, right? Because the way that you access this key is by doing .success. It doesn't matter where it falls in the object. Order doesn't matter in objects.
Say like well forward.
Yeah, would it look prettier if we put it at the bottom? Probably, yeah. Okay, questions about .ajax? All right. So again, I'm going to send out the full solution to this tonight for you to look at and mull over before Thursday. And then we'll go over a little bit more on Thursday at the beginning of class. But if you haven't finished it yet, continue working on it. Hopefully this put things in a little bit better perspective. I wanted to sort of trial by fire in some ways, and then kind of reassemble the pieces back here, because I think that's helpful to struggle with it a bit. But now's the time to kind of make sense of it. Okay, so let's get into the meat of today's class. Any final questions before we move on about the homework generally? Okay, excellent. So what we're talking about today is, I did want to show this. This isn't particularly important, but I think it's instructive as to how to think about certain things in JavaScript. So let's look back at the hint. So up here, we do this handlebars.compile every time we're working with templates, right? We use this handlebars.compile. So I just wanted to kind of help you visualize what are we doing when we type in handlebars.compile, right? So a couple of things we know, right? Handlebars must be an object, right? Handlebars must be an object, and the reason we know that is because we're using dot notation here. Okay? And we also know that the value at the compile key must be what type? A function. It must be a function because we're using parentheses after it, right? We can only use parentheses when something is a function. And if it's not a function, we get that type error that we saw when we started debugging. When this returns a value that we store into category template, what type is the thing that we store in category template? What does this function return? Okay. It returns a function.
Okay, yeah, okay, you're right.
Right? Because if we look at this, when we have this category template variable here, later on, we use that thing with parentheses, right? That means whatever this handlebars.compile function returns is also a function, okay? So just to visualize a little bit like what that might look like. So we said handlebars must be some object, right? We already know what objects look like. Somewhere inside that object, there's a key compile. The value at that key, we know must be a function because we can call it. That function takes some argument. Usually we call it source when we pass it in. Then it does some crazy stuff. Who knows what it does? Not really important for us to know that. And then at the very end, it's going to return a new function. Okay? So it's actually going to return some anonymous function there as the last step of this thing. And that function takes data, a model, say, and returns a rendered template string. Okay? So just wanted to sort of help you visualize like what's going on inside of there. We haven't really seen many of these or any of these functions that return functions. But this is totally something that you can do in JavaScript, and that's how the handlebars.compile works. Okay? So not super important to know in order to do this, but I think it helps to kind of put things into place. All right, let's talk about Firebase. So this is the cool new Firebase logo. It didn't used to have this logo. This is since Google acquired Firebase. It's now a Google product. And what this is, it's what we call a backend as a service. Okay? So when we're working with hosting or things of that nature, there's several different layers or several different kinds of hosting services we could use. We could use ones where they just basically give you a computer, right? And they say, okay, do whatever you want with this computer. And that takes a lot of configuration and a lot of know-how to make work. This is the other extreme. Firebase is a backend as a service where they give you basically the whole backend without any, very little configuration for you to work with. So this does all of the backend things for your application without you actually having to write your own backend. Okay? And it's very extensible, so it can be used for pretty much any web application or mobile application. So this is used for both web applications and for iOS and Android mobile applications. In fact, it could be used for any client-side application. Okay? So what does it give us? Well, it gives us a number of things. The most important and the most pressing are these first two. These are the ones that we'll look at in this class. The first is it gives us a mode of authenticating users. Right? So it gives us a way to register and log in users to our application. And this can be done via username and password, which we'll look at today. It can also be used for authenticating with any of the social sign-on things like Facebook or Twitter or Google. All of those will work with Firebase. It takes a little bit more configuration, but it can work almost as easily, almost as little code. The second thing that it gives us is a database. Okay? And this is really when we take those applications and start making them more interesting. The database allows us to store things, to retrieve those things, and so when we go to a website and then come back later, we can see those changes have stuck over time. Firebase also has a bunch of other features, including like file storage. So if we want to let the users upload images, say, or upload songs or videos, we could use Firebase to do that as well, file storage. We won't actually do that in this class, but you could do it. Yeah, question?
It's not so different from CMS. CMS is
Yeah, it's similar. It's kind of like that, except for it's an API that we can work with instead of being like a user interface where you enter it all yourself, right? So we can work with it programmatically, writing JavaScript instead of in a user interface like typing things in to a CMS. So yeah, you could think of it similarly to that. But it's slightly more extensible too, right? We could use this for any kind of application, not just like say a blog. We could use this for, a game or, a chat application is what we'll use it for today. So yeah, but kind of a similar way of thinking. It also gives you cool stuff like analytics on your application, like how many users are using it, what are they doing on the application. It lets you do things like A/B testing, like you can A/B test parts of your application. You can do, if you're using it for mobile apps, you can do like native mobile notifications, like push notifications, all kinds of stuff. It's an awesome product, and pretty much anybody who's like starting a new application these days will use something like this. And Firebase is kind of like the cream of the crop. It's sort of the best thing out there.
There's some of its competitors.
So its biggest competitor was something called Parse, which was a Facebook product. But they recently got rid of their hosted option. So if you want to use Parse, you have to host your own servers, your own Parse servers. Firebase is a Google product, and they do all the hosting for you. So it's actually a lot easier to use Firebase, but that's its biggest competitor. Yeah. There are probably a few others.
Amazon services, like
Amazon Web Services is far more granular than this, right? So we would call this a backend as a service. It's very like ready to go, ready to use. Amazon Web Services is what we call infrastructure as a service. It takes more configuration. You'd have to write your own server code and then deploy it there. It's it's more things involved. Whereas this is very much start writing JavaScript and go.
you do have buckets and stuff like pre-configured options.
Yeah, but nothing that would like be this usable out of the box.
Okay.
But it's similar. It's one step closer to the computer, right?
Is there like a limit to how much, like, if you have a million users, like, what would they think?
Totally. I don't know exactly what the number is, but there is a free plan, and unless your application really takes off, you're probably not going to breach that free tier. But yeah, it's some large number that's way outside of the scope of just you playing around with it and your friends, probably. But yeah, that's how they make money. Is eventually, if your app takes off, then they charge you by users or whatever. I don't know what the number is. Okay. So what we're going to do today is we're going to make a Firebase application. It's going to be a chat application, one that we can use to chat in the class and then like upvote different messages that come into the class. Okay, so that's what we're going to do, and we will start on that after we take a break because it's been about 2 hours. So let's go ahead and take that break, and then we'll come back and get started on this application.
Oh, I don't actually read those. I just have this read it. So it's fun to do.
Okay, fine.
Okay. Jesus. Basically what I'm doing is, so I have built, hopefully the works are contributed. So I just play things now, right?
Yeah.
I'm starting to build like useful parts of the fields. So so it's linking this, but my regex is auto. I'm gonna have to make a subdiv. Make a subdiv. Subdivs are necessary. I found some regex to auto href.
A tweet hashtag.
Oh well, I could do that, but I would if it was a hashtag, I would probably iterate through an array. But anyways, it adds the href around HTTPS.
Oh, cool.
So an HTTPS string, it adds.
Oh, nice. That's cool.
But the problem is I have a link to the tweet inside the class in which it's targeting, which isn't great. Because
Hard to visualize, but I think
basically,
yeah.
I already have a link there, and so, but regex doesn't give a shit if you're inside of an href already, so it's linking the link.
I see.
It's meta linking, which is not ideal. But that's just some HTML. So basically, what I just need to do is put in this cool. You don't get two shits.
No, I do. I'm just jealous. I wish I could do something like
Dude, really?
that. Yes.
You totally could do this.
I know. After the class, maybe. I'm still swimming. Like, I really need to like just spend the weekend just building my mini apps.
Like a Twitter call.
Something, yeah, even like something like that.
Don't start with Twitter. That would not be recommended.
I'm not a fan of their.
Your API is a bitch and a half.
Yeah, I know.
I gotta visualize this a little bit better. Dude, shit. Mostly. Nice.
So I don't think it actually did update because it doesn't have 14. And I am concerned.
Yeah. Let's go over here.
Stuff that we have big status.
Okay.
So,
Do you want
should
to
have
watch
done
that? So to make sure.
If I search Twitter, you will now auto link these.
Thanks.
Threads.
Huge.
So I have to make that. Well, yeah, basically. But so you can go to the tweet, but you can also just click on the stuff that it has. I'm probably going to help with that. Or I definitely just visited the Experience Security website and then looks like it's now on the list. They deserve it. It just means the NSA is going to spend extra time. Oh, well, I mean, General Assembly is a bunch of hackers, obviously. They're probably monitoring us all. You know. What the hell am I there?
Okay. Okay, so let's build this Firebase application. So here are the overall steps we're going to take. The first thing we've got to do every time we want to create a new Firebase application, we're going to have to register it. And actually, in order to do that, you'll have to have a Gmail account. Does anybody not have a Gmail account? Wonderful. Yeah, so it's a Google product, so it requires Google login in order to use Firebase. So we're going to do that first. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to set up the Firebase JavaScript library, the JavaScript client library as we call it. And we're going to get that all configured on our project. We'll then go through and learn the Firebase library's API. So we're going to learn the auth API. We're going to learn how to log in users, how to register users, how to log out users, and how to update our model when those things happen. And then after that, we're going to look at database. How do we interact with the database? And we'll look at something called CRUD, which I'll define later. And then finally, at the end of all this, we're actually going to deploy this to a URL where you can actually go anywhere in the world and type this into a browser and actually see it. And so that's going to be the last step. And Firebase makes that actually extremely easy. So we're gonna do all of that and more. But let's start by registering an application in Firebase. So if you just Google Firebase in Chrome, you want to click this first one that says firebase.google.com. There is a firebase.com. That's the old version pre-Google acquisition. We're not going to use that one. So use firebase.google.com. Okay. Now I'm just going to click this big call to action here in the middle. Get started for free. And if you are logged in, you should see a screen like this. I already have an application here, but while I was developing, but you should see something along this nature, and you should see a button somewhere that says create a new project. Does everybody see a button that says create new project? Excellent. So let's create a new project. And I'm going to have to call mine JS. We're going to call it JS Chat. I'm going to call mine JS Chat 1 since I already have a JS Chat from when I was developing, but we're going to call it JS Chat. United States is the region. And then I'm going to create the project. Okay. What? Yeah, you can have a ton of projects, and each one has its own separate dashboard that you can go in and look at. All right, so did everybody get a screen like this when they created their project? Excellent. So now what we're going to do is, okay, so it gives you some options. Add Firebase to your Android app, add to Firebase to your iOS app, or add Firebase to your web app. That's what we're going to click, but we're not going to do it yet. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to look at the starter code and make some sense of that before we come back here and get that code. So if we go back into the starter code, you'll see there is a folder, JS Chat. Okay? So this application is at approximately the same point as that first hint that I sent out last week. Okay? So it's at the point where it's got templates, it can render its model, it has some fake data in the model, and we can work with that. And what we're going to do is take it from that fake data, those templates, and integrate it with this Firebase backend as a service. So if we look at the index, you'll see we have some very simple HTML here. It says JS Chat in the H1. We've got this empty form container, and we've got this empty chat log container here, div. Down here, we've got our templates. And this is saying, if this is logged in, show this comment form. Else, we're going to show this register login form. Okay? And then down here, we have a chat template. It also uses this if logged in. And then it uses an each loop to render each chat message. Okay, so very similar to what we just saw, but here we're using it on some different model. And then let's take a look at the JS file. Okay. Here we have the model with our dummy data in it. Okay. Logged in key, a user, and some messages. You'll notice that these messages isn't an array. It's actually an object with these funky looking strings as the keys. And we'll talk about why we're using this structure in a little bit when we get to the database. And it's also got the render code, just like the last example we looked at. It's got the compile templates function and the render functions for each of the templates. And the controller right now doesn't do much. It just compiles those templates and then renders both of them. So we can actually go into the HTML, open this up, and just see what it looks like. And I'll make this a little bigger. So this is with a user that's logged in, right? They can type in something here and comment, and once we have this all hooked up, it would show one of these. And this is like an upvote button, so we can upvote this comment. And this is an X to delete it. If we type in something silly, we can just delete it. Okay, makes sense? All right, so let's go back to our Firebase dashboard here. And let's click this button, add Firebase to your web app. And that, once it loads, is going to give you some script tags. Everybody able to get those script tags? And we're just going to, it's very convenient, we're just going to hit this copy button and it'll copy to your clipboard. And now we can go to our project. And on the HTML page, you'll notice there's a comment here to do add Firebase. So we're just going to place the Firebase script tags right in there. I'm actually going to tab them so they line up with everything else. So the only important thing here is that these Firebase script tags come before our index.js, right? Because in our index.js file, we are going to use Firebase. We need to make sure that it's loaded before our JavaScript file. Okay, yeah.
We don't have to worry about publicly exposing API user, right?
No.
Because of the auth of the user itself.
Exactly. Exactly. Because the user still has to authenticate, even though we have all of this information.
Does it need to be after the jQuery script or just wherever?
It doesn't matter as long as it's before the index.js file. It doesn't matter. Yep. Okay, so we'll save that. All right, so now we've added Firebase to our application. All right, let's turn back to the slides. Briefly, we're going to look at a slide, and then come and add some code and look at slides, etc. Okay, so we've initialized this. We're good to go here. Okay, so let's talk about this thing we just added. These script tags we just added is the Firebase library. Right? Just like when we add the jQuery script tag, what we're adding is the jQuery library. Okay, and this client library, as we call it, will do a couple of things for us. One thing that it's going to do, primary thing it's going to do, is it's going to make a bunch of AJAX requests. Okay. So Firebase is going to make a bunch of AJAX requests on our behalf, when we tell it to, in order to do things like log in a user, retrieve data from the database, update data in the database, and all of those things. But all of those AJAX requests are going to happen inside of the Firebase library. So we won't actually see them. We don't have to write them ourselves. It's going to, what we say, abstract all of that away from us. So it's going to provide us these simple methods to work with, but under the hood, what Firebase is doing is making those AJAX requests on our behalf. Okay? So anytime you're working with a really complex HTTP API, such as Firebase or say Facebook, or one of the other ones that are very complex, it's often the case that they will give you a client library, or there's a client library that exists on GitHub, say, that handles all of the AJAX requests interacting with the API directly for you. Right? So anytime it's very complicated, oftentimes there's a JavaScript client library that kind of simplifies the process for us. And that's what all this is doing. I mean, we could make the AJAX requests ourselves, but it would be a lot more code, and it would be a lot more difficult to do. This provides an easy way for us to interact with Firebase. Questions so far? All right, keep going. So, like we saw when we talked about libraries and library APIs, it's going to come with a bunch of functions, obviously. A bunch of functions that we can call to do the various things. Another thing that we see sometimes in libraries or these custom client libraries is we'll see custom events. Okay, so we'll see events that aren't things like clicks and scrolls and hovers and those types of things. We'll see like custom events. In this case, we're going to look at one that says, the event is triggered when the user logs in, say. Or an event happens, when the user logs out, something of that nature. So oftentimes, libraries will use their own sort of event process in order to let you run functions when certain events occur. Okay? I mean, it's the same thing as running events when a user interaction occurs. It's just a different set of events. Okay? Conceptually, though, same process. All right, let's start looking at some specific things. So the first thing we're going to handle is auth. Okay? So the authentication of our user into our application. And like I said, we can do this a number of ways. Firebase lets us do it using email and password, which is what we're going to use today. But also it lets you use things like Facebook and Google and Twitter and a bunch of other providers if you want to use some sort of OAuth provider, open authentication provider, to do the authentication. It also lets you have anonymous users if you want to do it that way. So that's another benefit. If your app is like a game or something where you don't necessarily want to require the user to register, you could do that. You could have anonymous users as well. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is we're going to have to go back to our Firebase console. We're going to have to activate the email and password authentication provider. So we have to tell Firebase that we want to accept usernames and passwords. So here in the console, we're going to go to this Auth tab on the left-hand side. And over here, the second tab here says Sign In Method. And we're going to click that. And you'll see there's a bunch of sign-in methods here. Email, password, Google, Facebook, Twitter, GitHub is one too, and anonymous. And what we're going to do is we're just going to enable email and password. So if you click that row, turn this toggle to enable, and then hit save. So now our application is ready to start accepting usernames and passwords. Simple as that. Say, for instance, we only wanted users to register with Facebook. We could leave that one disabled and then enable Facebook instead. That's why they give you the option of enabling and disabling. Okay, back to the slides for a second. So the first thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need to allow users to register. And the Firebase auth has a function called, this is not great here, it's too long for this screen, but called create user with email and password. And that is a function that takes two parameters, an email address and a password. Okay? So let's go ahead and incorporate this into our application. So I'm going to...
So where to find it in Firebase console?
This specific method function name. There's documentation, API documentation for the library, and it has all of these methods, but it's very large, so it's going to take a while to get good at reading it. Okay, so here we are. Our HTML is now good. We've got our Firebase code loaded here. So we're going to turn now to the JavaScript. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start reverting some of this data from the fake model data, the dummy data that we were using to render this data with. And I'm going to start putting in the real data, which we know we're going to start them off as not logged in. Well, this user object won't be ready when we first start, so I'm just going to make that undefined. And we're not quite to the messages yet, so I'm just going to leave them as is, and we can worry about that later. Yeah, I just logged in false now and removed the user object. And we'll get to the rest when we get to it. So what we'll notice now is when we open this HTML page, we'll now notice because that template has the logged in false now, you'll see the login register form. Okay, so we're now ready to start accepting usernames and passwords. And let's take a look at this register form. We've got this register form. It's got a couple of inputs, one for email, one for password. And it's also got two buttons, one for register and one for login. Okay. Also notice that this is a div and not a form. Thus, we have no submit event. We still have to listen for a click event because it's not a form. Okay. Another thing we notice is this is in a template, and this form container is where that will eventually be placed, right? And since that login form isn't there when we first start, we're going to probably use some sort of delegated event listener in order to listen for that login or register event. Okay, just wanted to dissect that HTML a bit. Let's go back to the index.js. And if you scroll towards the bottom in the controller, there's a big to-do comment here that says we're going to add our event listeners right here. So right below that line, this is in the setup function. This is where we normally add our event listeners. We're going to add our first event listener. And I'm going to listen to that, I think it's called form container.
Yep.
Thank you. Form container, some element with the ID form container. And on its click event, remember we're going to delegate this to the button that we actually care about, which is the register button. So a button with the ID register. And the third argument that we pass here, right, is what?
We don't want to call it an anonymous function because it's the actual Firebase function, right?
Well, we are going to use the Firebase function. But before we do that, we're going to define just a function to call that function because there may be some other stuff we need to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to define a function called handle register.
Does it need to be named or can it be anonymous?
It could be anonymous if you want to set it up that way. It could be anonymous, absolutely. I'm going to name it because it allows me to keep things from being too nested. Okay, so now I need to define this function. Yeah. I don't need the two parentheses after handle register. Can anybody tell me why I don't need those two parentheses? Yeah. Exactly. Because here on line 50, we aren't actually calling handle register. We're passing it in to .on. This function won't actually be called until this click event happens. So when we use those parentheses, that's calling the function. That's saying, I want to run it right now in this setup function, which is not what we want. We want it only to happen when when this register button is clicked. So no, we don't need the parentheses there on line 50. I think my screen is yellowing a bit. Sorry, give me a second. My screen is, there it is. Yes, much easier to see. That happens over time, I didn't notice. Okay, so now we've got this handle register function. Does anybody know what the first thing we need to do here is? Yeah. Exactly. We need to find out what value the user put into those form inputs, right? We have to figure that out before we can do anything. So I'm going to create a variable here called email. Let me raise this up a bit. And the value I'm going to assign is let's look back at our HTML. Yeah, there's no ID. So I could add an ID. I could use a different selector to find them. I'm not going to modify the HTML. I'm just going to use a different selector. Oops. So I know it's an input that has a name attribute equal to email. Right? Anybody seen this CSS selector before? So using these square brackets in a CSS selector says it has some attribute, any attribute, that's equal to this value. And we're going to use jQuery.val in order to get that value out of there. So that's it. User entered email address. And we're going to do the same thing for the password. Okay. And now we only have one more thing to do, and that's to call the Firebase function, right? So we're going to type in Firebase .off. There's actually a function that we have to call in order to get back that off object. And then we're going to do dot create, see if I can remember, user with email and password. Fairly certain that's it. We'll find out. Exactly. And now I need to pass those parameters in. So we have that email variable, and we have that password variable. Question? Is it okay to what?
Pass this function password.
Yes. Yes. All of the encryption happens within inside of Firebase. So it's totally, you don't have to worry about encrypting passwords or any of that stuff. Firebase will handle all of the security concerns for you. If you were to console log it out, I mean, that's fine. Hopefully the user already knows what password they typed into the password field, right? The only person that's going to see that is them if they have their dev tools open. Right? So there's no security concerns about having the password here in the JavaScript. Because it only exists right there in your browser tab.
I think before, so for the
Delegated quick list. Yeah.
So since you're rendering the form before you put the event listener on, do you need it? Or?
So very good. I mean, good observation. What we said here is, since we're rendering this form before we attach the event listener, couldn't we just attach directly to that element? The answer is we could, but what happens if the user signs in, signs out, signs back in? That form was removed from the HTML and then added back. Right? And so in that situation, we would lose that click listener if we had attached to that element directly. So that's why this is sort of a better strategy, because we know this form container element is never going away, even if they sign in and out and in and out.
So like for our lab, we would work with it, was it a sign out, we could have like a sign in tab.
You could have, yeah, totally. So, but you know, an easy rule of thumb is just to not attach to something that's in a template, because then you won't ever, you know, get silently screwed. Because you wouldn't know exactly what's going on. It'd be very hard to debug, you know, type of thing. Okay, all right. So now we should have successfully created a user. Okay, let's go back to the document, the slides here for just a brief second. There's a similar function for logging in, and that's sign in with email and password. Okay, so on your own, try to do what we just did for register with username and password. Let me start with email and password for the login scenario. You'll notice the form has both a register and a login button.
Better to put the variables outside of the functions, so we don't have to call it again in the second.
Why couldn't we do that?
Oh, because of the event listener?
Yeah. So if we put them like right above the functions, say,
It wouldn't work.
why?
Because the handle register function is what collects it.
Exactly, because if we put it outside of the functions, it would attempt to collect that value as soon as the document loads, and it would be empty because the user hasn't entered anything yet. The only time we know that there's something in there is when they click the button.
I think I answered this like 5 times.
Yeah, it's okay. It
Different
takes,
various
yeah.
contexts, so I'm learning.
Yeah, I can count. It's actually 6. I'm sorry, I'm tired and snarky. Handle sign in. It's awful.
It's not. It's
Handle login is more. Yeah, do it right now. Are there any error parameters on the register or login?
There are. If you look in today's bonus material, you can see how you handle those errors. But you know, for sake of time and stuff, we're not going to go into too much detail there.
Cool.
But absolutely, like if they type in the password wrong or something like that, you need to handle it. Yeah.
Or if you wanted to require, I guess that would be an error. You handle that beforehand. Parts of the password beforehand for requirements.
Yeah, you could. Also, you can enforce those through through Firebase as well.
On the back end.
Mm-hmm.
CE login.
No, it's semantics.
Nice.
I mean, yeah, I was already on the. Although what I had.
Yeah, you had signed lowercase e.
Oh, yeah.
User casing.
All right, so hopefully you had a chance to give this a shot on your own. Basically, we're following the exact same formula, right? We're going to attach a delegated event listener to this form container, listening for you to click on the login button instead of the register button. And when that login click happens, we're going to run a function called handle login instead of handle register. And the handle login function is going to be essentially exactly the same, except for it's going to use sign in with email and password instead of create user with email and password. Okay? All right, so there's a couple more things that we have to do in order to make our authentication work. The next one that we will do together quickly is we can also implement this sign out. Okay, so we're also going to have to implement sign out. If we're going to let them log in and register, then we also have to let them sign out. And you'll notice this is simply a function, takes no parameters. You just call it and they're signed out. So let's go ahead and do that together. If you want to try it on your own, that's cool too. What we notice about the index.html is this comment form, that one also has two buttons, one for commenting and one for signing out. Okay. And so we're just going to use this button with the ID sign out in order to set up this one. So we know that it's actually going to end up in the same place in the HTML. So we can also use the form container. On its click event for that sign out button, we're going to handle sign out. Whatever we want to call it. Could have called it log out, I guess, but I didn't. Okay, well, we need to define that function. So I'm going to create a new function with the name handle sign out. And remember, the sign out function for Firebase takes no parameters. We don't need to collect anything from the HTML. We can just go ahead and call it firebase.auth.signout.
Why can't we just put it in the event listener in this case? It's just one line. Or is it just for consistency? It's just good to separate it.
Yeah, I think it looks neater. You could maybe put it in the event listener, like directly right here. However, that may have some unintended consequences. So I prefer this this way of doing it. Why? And also, why did I define this function first? No reason. It doesn't matter. I just wanted to keep it all here so you could see it.
This way you can understand the logic of when the function is actually called instead of trying to also understand the niceties of the on function and when parameters are handled. Like does it, call when the assignments had, call when, you know what I'm saying?
Okay, so let me ask you a question. Do you think this function, create user with email and password, this function sign in with email and password, this function sign out, do you think that these functions are synchronous or asynchronous?
Asynchronous.
Right, and why do we know that?
Because they're talking to another server.
Right, because under the hood, what these are doing are making HTTP requests, right? So making some AJAX requests underneath the hood, that's what they're doing. We don't see it, we don't really care about it, but what we do need to know is that these are asynchronous. So the way that we've handled asynchronous tasks thus far is by using callback functions, right? So imagine if this sign out took a callback function as a parameter, that would call it when it was done signing out. However, there's another strategy for dealing with asynchronous tasks, and that's by using events. Okay? So we can also use events for these things that happen asynchronously. And it just so happens that that's how Firebase handles its authentication. Okay? So as it's calling these asynchronous authentication functions, when it's done, either signing in or signing out or registering, when it's done with that, it's going to create this event on auth state changed. Okay? That state's change, it's either gone from signed out to signed in, or to signed in to signed out, or to not registered to signed in, whatever it might be. this on-off state change event will happen whenever one of those events occur. So this is a function, on-off state change, that takes a callback function, a function to call whenever that off state changes. Okay? So you can think of this very much like we would say, like on click, run this callback function, right? Same idea here. It's just instead of a user initiated click event, this is a off state change event. All right. So we're going to have to add this to our application in order to know when to update our model and tell our application model that the user has logged in. Okay? So let's look back at the code. Where do you think we will put that line of code, Firebase on-off state change? Where do you think we'll put that line of code? If you had to guess.
You only use it once.
We only need to use it once. You could use it multiple times, but you only need to use it once. Let me ask a leading question. Where do we put other event listeners? In the setup. Yeah. In the setup is where we attach all of our regular event listeners. So why not just put this event listener in the same place? Okay. So we're actually going to attach this event listener right here along with the rest of them. So instead of doing jQuery.on, we're going to do Firebase.auth.on-off state changed. And remember, this takes a parameter, and that parameter is the callback function. So what should we call this callback function?
Off state change.
Yeah. Just to stick with the pattern, I'm just going to call it handle off state change.
Does this function include a status with it? Does it send it back a status like logged in or registered or?
Yes, we'll look at that in a second. But yes, it does. It tells us inside the function we'll be able to tell where did it change from signed in to signed out or vice versa. Okay, so once again, I'm going to just put this at the top to keep everything together so that we can see it. But we're going to have to define this function now. Handle off state change. And this function will do a couple of things. All right, so let's look back into the slides for just a moment. The final thing that we're going to look at in the auth API is the auth API has a function here or a property here that stores the current user. Okay? The current user, so the user that is logged in. Okay? So if we're logged out, what do you think auth.currentUser will be?
Or
Undefined. Yeah, I heard somebody say it. If we're logged out, auth.currentUser will be undefined. If we're logged in, auth.currentUser will be some object, some user object. Okay? Okay, so this is what we're going to use in order to determine whether or not the user just logged in or whether or not they just logged out. So let's add this to our code. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a variable called user. And in that variable, I'm going to store Firebase.auth.currentUser. Remember, current user is here. It's not a function. It's just a property of that object. Okay, so we know that this variable here, user, will be undefined if they're not logged in, or it's going to be an object if they are logged in. Is undefined truthy or falsy? It's falsy, right? So basically we can say if user is truthy, right? If user is truthy, we know we're logged in. Okay? So let's do that. If user inside of this conditional, we know we must be logged in. Yeah.
Is the user referring to the user inside the model at the top, or just completely different area?
It's not yet, but we will take this user and put it in the model. Absolutely.
But at this point, it just this is the first time.
Yeah, at this point, it has no affiliation with the model yet.
About to in 2 seconds.
Yes. So right, inside this if, we know we're now logged in, so it's now time to update the model and let it know that the user is now logged in. So the first way we'll do is, if you notice up here, the model has a logged in property. We'll go ahead and set that to true. And the second thing you'll notice, if you scrolled up, I'm not going to do it since people are following along. The second thing you'll notice is that the model has a user key. And inside of that user key, we're going to store the user object from Firebase. Okay? And now that our templates, now that our model has updated, what can we do now in order to update our interface?
Render the template.
We should render the templates, right? We've now updated our model. We're going to now render the templates. That's always the pattern. Get some data, update the model, render the templates. So let's go ahead now and re-render our templates. So there's 2 of them. I'm just going to copy them from setup. Paste them here. So if we're not logged in, we must be what? Logged out. So in this else block, I'm going to do some other stuff. I'm going to add an else after this if, because if we're not logged in, then we must be logged out. And so here, I will update the model logged in equal false. And I'll also update the model dot user. And what do you think I'll set that to?
Undefined.
I'm going to reset it back to undefined, just like it started. Exactly right. We could if we wanted to, but here, what are we going to do? We've updated our model. What do we do after we update the model? Render. Well, we notice here at the end of the if and at the end of the else, we're rendering in both of those. So since we're doing the same thing in both, we can actually take those and move them outside of the conditional. Since those 2 lines happen either way, we're just going to move them outside of the conditional. Oops. Okay, this is pretty good timing. We're going to play with this and see if it works. And then next class, we'll actually start using the database. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to reopen this index. Just right-click it and open in browser. Okay. Now, I've never used this application before, right? So I'm going to need to register. And Firebase will require it to be an actual email address or to look like an actual email address. So type in an email address there, and you also have to type in a password. You can try typing that right. And now I will click the register button. And if everything has gone according to plan, you should see this template change. If it didn't, take a look in your console, see if there are any red errors. Also, I've posted all the code that I've done so far in Slack, so you can kind of compare mine to yours and see if you made mistakes.
Sign in user password is not a function. Oh, good.
Probably capitalization issue.
Already checked. Must be it.
Okay, so obviously these comments aren't real yet. Remember, we left that fake data about the comments in our model. But we've now actually really logged in, and if we click this sign out, we should also really log out. And now I should be able to put in my same email address and password, and now this time I can click login, and it will bring me back into the app. Another nice thing about the way we've set this up is if I refresh this page, I'm automatically logged in. It's going to keep track of the fact that I logged in. And in fact, I could even open this in a new tab and I would still be logged in until I sign out. So with all of that, it's a few lines of code, really not too much code. We now have a functioning bulletproof authentication system. Question?
Okay, so I'm looking at this on my local computer. Is there a way to see this?
Not yet. We're not there yet. But we will look at how to get it to that point where we can both run a server locally and deploy it to an actual server with just a few strokes of the keyboard. And we'll look at that next class.
I got a 400 error. This user may have been deleted on the
May have to stack overflow that, but it sounds like some issue with like maybe you already registered it or something. So try logging in. Anyway, any other questions before we wrap this up? We're about out of time. Cool. I will send out what we did so far. I'm also going to send out the solution to the lab. So take a look at those things, mull them over a bit, and then on Thursday we'll come back and we will finish this, and we'll also do a little bit more lab review. But with Firebase, you're now all set to work on your final project. I mean, this is pretty much the last piece of the puzzle. What we're going to cover after this is like some advanced JavaScript language stuff, but you can do your whole project without knowing any of that stuff. I mean, it's sort of sugar on top of the knowledge that we already have. Another thing I wanted to mention is, we're not going to have any more homeworks, like weekend formal homeworks. I'll give like maybe review stuff and things you can practice, stuff you can work on, but the last graded homework was still turning in that lab. From now on, I really want you to focus on working on that final project. And so that's going to be really our focus from here on out. Any questions? I think Paul posted the exit ticket, so please, if you could, fill that exit ticket out before you leave. And next class, we're going to continue building our application. 15 is the human number.
They're both human, Jacob.
Oh, yeah.